The world's wildlife is facing the real threat of a slow extinction. That's according to reports from the UN and the World Wildlife Fund. Habitat shrinking, species disappearing. Is there only space on the planet for the human race alone? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. The battle to preserve the world's wildlife and its habitats is being lost. That's according to a new United Nations report, which says attempts to stop the slow destruction of the Earth's wildlife habitats are failing dismally. This echoes a recent report by the World Wildlife Fund, which says half of the world's wild animals have been lost in the past 4 decades. This bleak picture is emerging as representatives from 200 nations meet in South Korea to discuss what, if anything, can be done. Before we speak to our guests, Al Jazeera's environment editor, Nick Clark, looks at the latest findings.
The reports make for troubling reading. In 2010, governments agreed more than 50 targets to try and slow the destruction of species habitats, cut pollution and stop overfishing by the end of the decade. How many are on track? Just 5. Why should we worry? Well, look at the facts. Since 1970, the number of wild animals living on land has nearly halved. In the ocean, it's not much better. The numbers of marine animals have fallen by 40%. And it's worse for certain species. For example, the sea turtle population has crashed by 80%. The fastest decline of wildlife was found in freshwater rivers and lakes, where populations are now a quarter of what they were in 1970. And it's no coincidence that this animal has prospered in the meantime. The number of humans on the planet has nearly doubled since 1970, from 3.6 billion to 7.1 billion. But conservation efforts can turn things around. Just as an example, not long ago, the otter was close to extinction in the United Kingdom. Now it can be found in rivers and streams right across the country. And there is progress towards a target of protecting 17% of the world's ecosystems on land. But a similar target for the oceans is likely to be missed. One final take-home message for those meeting in South Korea. They're being told that to sustain the world's current rate of consumption, you would need something we don't have, the equivalent of 1.5 planet Earths.
Well, to discuss all of this, let's bring in our guests. In London, Adam Roberts, Chief Executive Officer of the Born Free Foundation. Joining us on Skype from Pyeongchang in Korea, Braulio Ferreira de Souza Dias, United Nations Executive Secretary of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in Geneva, Carlos Truz, Director of the World Wildlife Fund's Global Species Programme. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Adam Roberts in London. In a world full of suffering people, the question some ask is, why should we care about other species?
Well, I think because we're all interconnected and that humans can have a significant benefit from a robust and bountiful planet that has all of its biological diversity maintained. And of course, it's great that you're covering this in advance of the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting, but I think we could possibly rename the convention from CBD to the consumption of our biological diversity, because that, I think, is at the core of what we're dealing with: human consumption of wildlife and wild places, and the impact that that has not only on the ecosystems, but all of the animals and plants that thrive in those ecosystems.
Well, Carlos Truz, your view, why is this so important to the human race?
Well, what the decline is showing us is really a thermometer of the way in which we have been administering the natural resources, which are so essential for the survival of our own species. And I don't think that the results are something to be proud of. I'm particularly alarmed by the fact that in the freshwater systems, in lakes, rivers, and marshes, we see a 76% decline in species. That is definitely unprecedented. But when you look in detail, then you will see that some species have actually already gone extinct, like the baiji, a freshwater dolphin. And the golden toad was an example. When I first arrived in Costa Rica in the early 90s, that species had already disappeared as the first official victim of climate change. I could no longer take photographs of that animal in particular, but I think the species go beyond the spiritual and recreational value. In the oceans, for example, marine resources are providing for 660 million jobs worldwide. That is not negligible, and that, of course, relies on a sustainable use of marine resources.
Braulio Diaz, already we've heard the complex problems that emerge here, and already very clear is a direct linkage between the future of the human species and the animals, the wildlife, the sea animals and mammals and fishes that actually share the planet with us.
We are directly dependent on healthy ecosystems and diversity of life. In many ways, we depend on biodiversity for our daily needs, for the food that we eat, for the clean water, for the clean air. We depend on biodiversity for our medicines. We depend on ecosystems like forests and mangroves to buffer the impact of extreme weather events like floods and droughts, to protect coastal cities from tsunamis, for example. It's essential, for example, to adapt to climate change. So the continuous loss of biodiversity is also reflected in the loss of genetic diversity of crops and animal breeds and other organisms important for food production, like pollinators. So we risk really the survival of human beings by this loss of biodiversity, and the consequence is a collapse in what we call the ecosystem services that really allow us to enjoy a good life and implement our economic activities. So this will affect us in many, many different ways, all of us.
Well, Carlos Drews, I want to pick up on something that Adam Roberts said right at the beginning. The primary issue here is that of human consumption. What's your view of that statement?
The decline that we are seeing in the birds and the mammals, the reptiles, the frogs and toads, and in the fishes come from two sources. One is habitat degradation and loss, and the other is overexploitation from hunting and fisheries. So there is a lot of consumption going on, evidently, and this is of prime importance in a marine setting in particular, because here what we're putting at stake is food security and job security issues of millions of people. But from a consumption point of view, there are different ways to look at it. There is a use that is non-lethal, such as for tourism, and wildlife has proven to be the economic driver of Rwanda around mountain gorilla visitation, for example, or Tanzania and Kenya. Without actually killing the animals, these economies are able to make considerable benefit. So you have to consider those two aspects, and I believe that habitat degradation is definitely another one that needs to be approached, and climate change is taking a big toll and will continue to do so in terms of the quality of the habitats for the world's wildlife.
Adam Roberts, is it possible to isolate a prime reason for the situation that we are looking at, or are the causes all too layered, a perfect storm of problems that are emerging at the same time?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that we tend to make these issues much more complex than they really are. And for most average people, no matter where they are in the world, when you talk about biological conservation, biodiversity conservation, ecosystem degradation, habitat loss, climate change, these are all such enormous issues. And for the average person, it's very hard to get your head around how do we tackle these enormous issues. But the biggest question is always how to put our resolve, including the resolve of the delegates who will be participating in the CBD meeting, into action. And when when we look at very specific examples, whether it's overfishing, trophy hunting of elephants, or poaching of elephants for their ivory in the Selous ecosystem in Tanzania, which has led to a 66% decline in that elephant population in just 4 years, or lion trophy hunting, all of these things we can have a measurable impact on as individuals by not consuming these resources, or as activists and advocates for the ecosystem and the planet by contacting our government officials and asking them to take measured reaction to make sure that human short-sightedness doesn't cause the habitat decline, the deforestation, and the conservation degradation that we're talking about here today. I think we really need to get to the root of each of these individual issues and take individual actions in order to have a prosperous planet for the future.
Well, Braulio Diaz, you are being joined by delegates from around the world at this particular convention. There have been benchmarks within this. The Convention of Biological Diversity was signed back in 1992. 4 years ago, it was declared to be the decade of biodiversity. What do you need to do to not only enroll and enlist and encourage all the delegates there that are arriving, but for them to take a message back to their governments that it hasn't been working for the past 4 years, has it?
Well, it's a complex problem, and there's no simple answer. We need to mobilize not only governments, but also the business sector and all the society as consumers. So clearly, it's a mismatch. In the past, when we had a much smaller population, human population, as the natural resource and ecosystem in a given area were degraded, people would just migrate to another place. But with the current size of human population and the occupation of virtually all habitable places on Earth, we have reached our limits, so there's nowhere else to go. So we really have to review business as usual, our practice. So business as usual cannot continue. We have to change our consumption patterns. We have to change the production patterns. We have to shift our economic instruments and subsidies. If we still have unsustainable fisheries, it's in part because governments still subsidize these unsustainable fisheries. In the agriculture, it is the same thing. So we're clearly coming to a situation where we will have to confront these challenges so that we can deliver on enhancing food production on one side and ensure healthy ecosystems for human populations. But at the same time, we need to ensure that our efforts in conservation and sustainability of the use of biodiversity is ensured. The good news is that we have the solutions. And there are many good initiatives all over the world that have demonstrated that we can revert these trends. But the efforts so far are not sufficient. That's one of the main conclusions of the report that was launched here yesterday. We have to upscale efforts. And this requires political resolve. It requires financial resources. It requires partnerships between developed and developing countries. It requires engagement of the business sector. So again, it's not just one simple solution. We need to do all this to revert the situation.
Well, Carlos Drews, very clearly dealing with this issue is very layered, and the issue is looking at sociological, ecological, economic factors as well. These are the contexts that have to be approached. It's not enough to say, stop poaching, is it? You need something much wider and much more broadly expanded to actually start dealing with the situation.
Yes, and indeed, one of the problems is that we haven't really put a real value of wildlife to people. So what is the social cost of losing the wildlife? What's the environmental cost of losing all these environmental services that we have heard described during this program? Once that enters the national bookkeeping, then we have a much better idea of how precious it is, not just for this generation, but for the generations to come. And in realizing that, we will have to put enough resources then into our banking system. These are the protected areas, and the report of WWF and the Zoological Society of London has demonstrated that protected areas are effective at halving the decline that we are seeing on average elsewhere in terrestrial ecosystems to something in the order of 19% decline over the last 40 years instead of 39%. So what is it that we are doing to protect what is in there? Protected areas, of course, we need much more of them. We need them better connected, but we need them much better resourced. And if we look at nature as our natural capital, this is the savings that we have, and we would like to use the interest. Where are we keeping the savings? We keep the savings in banks, in very well professionally run banks, but protected areas are not anywhere close to that. That's the realization that needs to happen for a commensurate investment to go into the protected area system.
Adam Roberts, that's an interesting point, the whole concept of protected areas, the investment, the interest on the human investment in our future. What's your view of that?
I think investment is exactly the right word. We have to make an investment in protecting these animals and protecting their role in the ecosystem and protecting the ecosystem in which they thrive. And that investment is going to have yields that are paid back for decades, if not centuries. And what we always try to explain to people when we work from Born Free's perspective is that these animals are actually worth more alive than dead, worth more to the ecosystem, but also worth more to the local economies and to the people who live in those ecosystems. Those livelihoods are going to be enhanced when you have tourists coming, for example, to Africa to see live elephant herds year after year for 50, 60, 70 years, the same elephant. That can bring much greater returns on the investment to a local community than one hunter, one poacher coming and taking that resource, which not only depletes the environment and the communities of having that natural living resource, but also creates an instability that allows national security to fall apart and other economic indicators to decrease themselves. So really, it's all about these living, healthy ecosystems and all of the component parts within that makes a strong investment not only for now, but into the future. I think it's exactly right.
Braulio Diaz, you're dealing, as I mentioned, with a lot of representatives there who are representing a lot of governments, a lot of interests. And there are a lot of vested interests in this. You yourself mentioned the big corporations, for example. The difficulty of getting a international agreement on something like protected areas. You've got to deal with governments, you've got to deal with corporations. There has to be some kind of standardization, does there not? Some kind of common program that is put into place around the globe, or is that just idealistic thinking?
No, it's not just an idealistic thing. And of course, part of the problem is that we have been promoting a number of good efforts in the environment community with protected areas, with programs to save threatened species. But in fact, we need to deal with the root causes of loss of biodiversity. So these root causes are in the social and economic sectors. And we're talking about, as I mentioned, the issues of economic incentives, subsidies, the prices of goods and services. And the problem is the asymmetry in terms of who benefits and who pays the cost of these things. So many local communities, they have little options but to cut down the trees to get some economic benefits for their livelihoods. Even though we can demonstrate theoretically that they would be better off by leaving the trees standing. But we need to find proper governance arrangements. So, for example, I was told by the delegates from Nepal that they have solved the problem of poaching of wildlife. And I said, well, how was that done? And they said, well, a partnership between government and local communities. And I said, well, but what was the incentive for the local communities to really go out of their ways to fight against the poachers? And they said, well, the governments have promoted that 50% of all the incomes of protected areas go directly back to the local community. So then the community sees that their efforts provides a direct return to them. We're seeing similar schemes. For example, Chile has established more than 700 exclusive local fisheries concessions. So local fishermen have exclusive rights to fish in these places. And then that's an incentive for them to stop overfishing and promote conservation, because they are assured that their efforts will benefit themselves. So it's an issue of establishing appropriate governance systems to benefit those that are directly related to decisions for the wildlife and for ecosystems. So this can be done. It's happening in many places. Namibia has a wonderful program called Conservancy agreements with local communities also, and they get the financial returns from tourism, but they have to demonstrate that they're managing in a sustainable way the wildlife. So there are many good experiences out there, but these needs to be upscaled, and there's always barriers in terms of policy decisions to mediate between conflicts of interest, which exists everywhere.
Well, Carlos Drews, what does appear as well is that there's a direct correlation between poverty and the shrinkage of habitat and of wildlife. Recent research says that richer countries have seen a 10% increase in wildlife population in recent years. The return of the otter to British waters was mentioned at the top of our show, whereas poorer countries are seeing a 56% decline. So what you're looking at here is an issue that it is about far wider things than national development. It's about the economies of a country. It is about rich and poor.
Of course, and we have to see that the problems of biodiversity conservation and climate change have to be tackled internationally, globally. So we have to ensure that enough resources flow from the countries that have to the countries that do not have enough at this point in time, but that they have made a pledge to protect the biodiversity, not just for their national interests, but for humankind as a whole. Ensuring those financial flows is critical. Increasing, of course, the amount of money that is spent on biodiversity conservation is a prime interest at the Convention of Biodiversity just now, and a topic of hot and important discussion. I think this is definitely the way forward. And when you look at the study itself, you see the decline in the tropics being far more pronounced than in the temperate region. But let's bear in mind that the major decline in the temperate regions already happened before 1970, when we started collecting the data on population trends. Probably 100 or 150 years ago, we saw the greatest decline in the northern countries, in the more affluent countries. And what we're seeing today is a desperate need to bring back nature to as close as we can to where it used to be. So restoration of ecosystems plays a key role in areas where biodiversity has already been decimated decades ago.
Now that timeline that you mentioned there coincides with the Industrial Revolution, does it not? Clearly there's a linkage.
Absolutely, and it will get even worse, because what the Industrial Revolution brought was the use of fossil fuels to speed up development in a major way and technological progress. Now we are challenged with an atmosphere that is warming up, and there are very clear indications already that biodiversity is seeing the effects. We have polar bears with a reduced bodily condition, caribou numbers may be dropping also as a result of climate change. In marine turtles, it's a very interesting case because the sex of the hatchlings of turtles is determined by the temperature in the sand, and the warmer it gets, the more females you get, and we are already seeing a majority of females hatching from the world's beaches for marine turtles, creating, of course, a great challenge for reproduction later down the road. And if these beaches continue to warm up, then you will only see boiled eggs, and that's then the ultimate apocalypse for marine turtles in the globe. So it is evident also in a tangible way for fishermen, because the fish are now now moving towards cooler waters and deeper waters, and that means further away from the shore in tropical areas. The journey to fish them is no longer profitable. You spend a lot of money on your fuel for very little returns. So it has an immediate effect on livelihoods as well. This is not a romantic perception. This is talking about livelihoods and the sustenance of humankind.
Adam Roberts, very quickly, that last statement there, this is about mankind, humankind. This is about sustaining our futures, is it not?
Yeah, I think so, and it's about our responsibility. That's probably the best word, our responsibility to ensure that there is a safe, healthy ecosystem for everyone to enjoy, and that includes animals, plants, and humans alike. And that by making that investment and taking on that responsibility, whether it's in a multilateral agreement such as the CBD or the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species or Convention on Migratory Species, there are all these opportunities to take responsibility and act, but the individual governments have to put in place the laws to enforce those agreements and enforce that resolve, and that's what's going to really yield returns, again, for many years forward. That's the key, taking on the responsibility for a safe and healthy planet long term.
Well, scratching the surface, but my thanks to our guests, Adam Roberts, Carlos Drews, and Braulio Ferreira de Souza Diaz. And thank you too for watching. Feel free to add your voice to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. From me and the team, goodbye for now.